Motivate, Engage, Influence and Control. Part 2. Introducing switches. Until relatively recently, switches were the primary access method for students with profound and complex additional needs. Switches were the perfect fit for students who were unable to use a mouse or a keyboard, who may have problems when it comes to actually using their hands to touch the screen. Cognitively, they were relatively easy to understand. I press a switch and something happens on the screen. And for many of the students in this group, switches would be their introduction to access technology. Often their very first experiences of using a computer would be by pressing a switch with a cause and effect activity. And like many of you, I began to take an interest in using switches with students when I came across young people who found it difficult to access touch screens. I could give a child a switch, usually one of those big wooden things borrowed from the multi-sensory rooms at the time, pop on our trusty copy of Blob, and the child would be doing something. And that in itself was something quite magical, because many of these students spend their whole day waiting for things to be done to them. Switches gave us an opportunity for children to be able to begin to interact with the world around them. However, it wasn't long before that didn't seem quite enough. I started asking myself questions like, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for? What am I trying to achieve by this? Surely there's something beyond just pressing a switch and Blob wobbling on the screen. How does that fit in with this child becoming more independent or being a more effective communicator? And those were difficult questions to answer back then, because nobody seemed to have an answer to it. It seemed like it was enough that the child was actually doing something without really thinking about where that something could go. And as teachers, educators, therapists, parents, we want to know where that something's going, that there is some real benefit to doing that activity. Those nagging questions prompted an extended period of research and reflection into what was positive about using switches and where it could go. And that led to the first draft of what would become Priory Wood's switch progression model. That model sought to define our switch use in school, from the very earliest levels with experiential, pre-intentional learners, through cause and effect and using switches to make things happen, and on to using switches to make independent choices. And it served us very well. Our biggest problem was having enough software to actually be able to teach those skills in a meaningful way. There were 2 or 3 pieces of cause and effect software on the market at the time, and if you needed something to make an independent choice, the only thing really available was Clicker, which was light years away from where many of our students with complex needs were. That lack of software became the driving force for developing our own applications to use with children, first with PowerPoint and then with other tools like Flash or JavaScript. Back in 1999, I was invited to a meeting at the Northern Grid for Learning, an organisation who were looking to produce a piece of software that could be run online for children with special needs. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to plug the software gap for our school. So I went armed with a specification for a program that would be perfect for our needs. I designed the program specifically to meet all of the target areas in our switch progression document, and I was really pleased when my colleagues at the Northern Grid for Learning decided that they were going to make this piece of software. The software was developed and given the name SendSwitcher. I've always hated that name. I never quite understood why they chose it. I wrote quite a long document to accompany the software online, and that laid out our understanding of switch progression at the time. It started with experiential learners, moved through cause and effect, into early timing skills and tracking skills, and then into using switches to make independent choices with scanning. The software and its accompanying guidance document became very popular with colleagues around the world logging onto the NGFL website to use the software online. Even back then, in the earliest days of the internet, it wasn't uncommon to see 400 or 500 schools around the world connect to the NGFL website to use the software. What was perhaps more unexpected were the number of schools who used the guidance document and the software to inform their own plans for teaching switch access skills. I still get emails now, 20 odd years on, from schools that use SENSwitcher every day. 10 years later, I had the opportunity to rewrite that document and look again at what constitutes progression, this time informed by advances in technology and the experience of using that document for 10 years. The result of that was the Learning Journey Switch Progression Roadmap, which I wrote for Inclusive Technology during my time there. Over the years, I'd come to believe that the progression as defined in the SENSwitcher document was a little too linear, hierarchical. It gave the impression that a child couldn't move on until they'd mastered a specific skill, and in some ways that was wrong. So with the Switch Progression Roadmap, I was able to address those things, and in particular the levels describing cause and effect, which in the SENSwitcher document were seen as separate levels. Press and hold a switch, level 1. Press and let go, level 2. Press a switch again to keep something going, level 3. Press a switch to turn something on or turn something off, level 4. And people assumed that a child had to have mastered level 1 before they could move to level 2. And of course there's a huge problem there. If level 1 is a child can hold down a switch, and that child just happens to have cerebral palsy and isn't able to maintain pressure on a switch for any length of time, then they'll never master level 1. So with the Switch Progression Roadmap, all 4 of those methods of access at a cause and effect level became one level, where a child could experience using the switches at any of those 4 different levels, and they would all be equally valid. I also addressed the hierarchical nature of the skills by presenting it as a roadmap, a way to get from one place to the next, and how the child gets there kind of depends on them rather than following strict rules of you must have this, then this, then this, then this. I suppose what we're talking about is an early version of presumed competence. Like its predecessor, the Switch Progression Roadmap became very popular too. It's used in schools right across the world and helps inform good practice in the use of switches with children with complex needs. But just as technology moves forward, giving us new and better tools, our understanding of our use of technology evolves too, and practice changes. So in the last couple of years, I've had another look at the Switch Progression Roadmap and made some changes. This new, updated and simplified skills progression model is available on my website, where you'll also find lots of useful resources to support teaching skills with this model, including lots of free activities to use with it. Because we're talking about children with profound and complex needs in this workshop, we'll be focusing purely on the cause and effect levels of this switch progression model, and I've highlighted them on the slide. Press and hold a switch, press and let go of a switch, press it again, on and off. It's important to remember that these are not separate levels. They only describe a way in which a student might interact with a switch, and they all have equal value. So if we're working with a student, it would be fantastic if the child was able to demonstrate that they could use a switch across all 4 of them. But it's not necessary for progression for a child to be able to demonstrate skill in all of them. In this workshop, we'll explore each of those in turn and in some depth, and explore how they contribute to the child making progress towards being able to make independent choices. But before we get to talking about progression, let's talk about the switches themselves. One of the questions I used to get asked a lot was, what's the right switch for X child? And that's always a very, very difficult question to answer, especially as I don't know X child. Switches come in all shapes, colours and sizes, and the type of switch that you need will be different depending upon the person that's going to use it. A whole industry has grown up around switch assessment, and there are all manner of documents out there that you can take a look at. The general rule of thumb is that a switch needs to be big enough for somebody to be able to see and press. It needs to be positioned in a place where the child can press it without causing them any pain or discomfort, and it needs to work. I can't emphasize that enough, especially when we're working at a cause and effect level. If the child makes the effort to press the switch, something needs to happen. If you're looking for information regarding assessment of children for switches, there's lots of information on my website. Remember too that if you're going to use a switch with a computer, you will need some form of switch interface. And there are lots of those on the market at very different prices. The ones I recommend most are the ones that you're most likely to find in your school anyway. Those would be the Inclusive Simple Switch Box, the Crick Box, or the AbleNet Hitch Box. Don't get too excited if your switch box has lots of sockets. Most students will only ever use 1 or 2 switches, and there's little or no software that will allow children to collaborate with switches. More sockets doesn't necessarily equate to better switch box. The best switch boxes allow you to change the input from the switch. Standard computers have neither software or circuitry to understand what a switch is, let alone what it's supposed to do when you press it. Thankfully, the switch interface helps here. When you press a switch through a switch interface, the interface will convert that switch press into either a mouse click or a press of a key on a keyboard, which the computer can read and do something with. Almost all commercially available switch software, and certainly all of the activities on my website, are programmed to accept either the press of a space bar or a left mouse click as their main source of input. The switch interface converts the switch press into either a space or a mouse click, and the program will then respond. Being able to change what the switch interface sends to the computer when you press the switch allows you to use a switch with all kinds of different software. For example, if you set the switch interface to send a right arrow key and press the switch, you could use the switch to control slides in PowerPoint. So when you're ready to work with a student with their switch, plug in the interface, plug the switch into the interface, and test it. We really want to make sure that something happens when the child presses the switch. Let's look at each of those access methods in turn. Press and hold. This is when the child is able to maintain pressure on the switch, keep the switch active over an extended period. We see this most often with switch toys, where when the child presses the switch, the toy will work. When they take their hand from the switch, the toy stops working. And there's a lovely photograph there of one of my students doing just that. While she presses the switch, the fan will turn. When she takes a finger from the switch, the fan will stop. Note that I haven't given her a big switch. And the reason for that's simple. She doesn't need a big switch. She's able to isolate a finger and press a switch of that size. So there's little or no point in replacing the switch that she can use with something that's bigger simply because we can. Remember that the switch we choose for a student should reflect their ability to be able to press it. If they need a big switch, fine, we'll give them a big switch. If, like this student, they're able to isolate a finger and use a small switch, then use small switches. We use this press and hold access method with students, largely because it's the easiest for them to understand. When they press a switch, something happens. While they keep their hand on the switch, that continues to happen. When they move their hand away from the switch, the activity stops. Cognitively, that's easy to process. When my hand's on the switch, this happens. When my hand's not on the switch, it doesn't happen. And we can use this access method in lots of different ways. Although there's very little software which works this way, a lot of the activities in the multisensory room will. pressing a switch to keep the bubble tube working, pressing a switch to make lights chase around the ceiling, pressing a switch and holding it to keep music playing. However, it's not for everyone. There are some students who will struggle physically to be able to hold a switch down. Those are the students with cerebral palsy, or students with tremors, or students who are unable to maintain any form of pressure on the switch. But that doesn't really matter. This is only one of 4 ways that we can interact with a switch. If the child's not physically capable of being able to access a switch in this way, don't worry, try one of the other methods. Press and let go. This is perhaps the most common method of activating a switch. The student presses the switch and lets go, and the effect, the reward, will play. For example, a big message on a Big Mac or an animation on a computer. This is how our students will use their switches as they move forward and gather more skills. One of the big problems with this particular level is that the switch can also be activated by involuntary movements, for example a tremor or a spasm. And if that movement activates the switch and the reward's played, that can be a real problem when it comes to the child developing their understanding that by pressing the switch they are making that effect happen. So it's really important that we make sure that the student's use of the switch is intentional. In some software packages there are settings which can filter out unintentional switch activations, usually caused by tremors or spasm. However, that doesn't really address the problem. A far better approach is to work on the behaviour, encourage the child to press the switch and move their hand away from the switch in order to watch the reward. If you're interested in what that Chinese characters are on the screen, they spell out the word press the switch in Mandarin Chinese. As I mentioned earlier, we need to be very careful about the prompts that we give and avoid using prompts like press the switch, which shift the focus of the activity to the switch itself rather than the reward that the switch generates. As almost all cause and effect software works in this way, we have a huge number of tools that we can use when we're working with students at this level. Remember too that Big Macs are one of the best ways of using switches at this level in your classroom. There's really nothing that happens in your classroom where you can't use a Big Mac. Press it again. This is often called switch building, and its purpose is to help the student understand that they may need to press a switch a number of times in order to complete a simple sequence. It also models the repeated switch pressing that's required for 2-switch step scanning. Press it again is one of the areas that I have most difficulty with. When I designed SenSwitcher back in 1999, the aim of this level was to understand that the child may need to press the switch a number of times in order to complete a simple sequence. What's important isn't the number of times the child presses the switch, it's that they notice that something has changed on the screen every time they press it. Sadly, this was interpreted quite simplistically by the software companies at the time, who decided that this was best expressed as a series of activities where, with each successive press of the switch, a picture was built up. For example, the first press would give us a dog's head, the second press the dog's body, the third press the dog's tail, and so on. And with the final press, the dog might bark or jump around and give the child a reward. So what's the problem here then? Well, one of the first things we noticed about students that were using activities like this was that they began to tap the switch again. You know, the kind of thing where the child repeatedly taps on the switch in order to make something happen, and we needed to understand why. The problem seemed to be connected to our students' expectations of what would happen in the activity. Up until this point, whenever they pressed the switch, they were given a reward. But now we've changed the rules. Whenever they press the switch, something changes or appears on the screen. And they are somehow, from that, supposed to understand that they are building toward a reward. And of course, we weren't seeing that at all. What we were seeing with child tapping the switch repeatedly over and over. Certainly for some of our students, the problem had to do with the pictures we were using. If we break a picture up into parts, and the child is expected then to recognise those parts constitute a whole. So for example, a cow's head is part of a cow. But understanding and identifying a picture from parts of a picture is quite a high level skill, and sometimes way beyond where some of our students actually are. So when they press the switch and see these images on the screen, they may not actually understand what they are. So I pressed the switch, something appeared on the screen, I don't know what it is, so I revert back to what I know, which is press the switch again, and the same process happens. So the child will press it again and again and again and again, and eventually they'll get the reward. And what they learn from this process is that I now have to tap the switch over and over quickly, and eventually I'll get the reward that I'm seeking. The companies who make software like this recognise the problem, not least because people like me kept reminding them of this problem, and took some steps to try and solve it. They put in a time delay so that when the child had pressed the switch, they couldn't press it again for another 5 seconds. Of course, time delays and removing prompts from screen mean nothing to a child with complex needs, so the pattern just carried on exactly as was before. They also tried to address the image issue and remove the images, so let's not have a cow's head, let's have a silhouette of a cow or an infill pattern of a cow, and with each press we'll fill in that picture, that outline. And of course most of us know that that's no way easier than building the picture from parts of a picture. In fact, it's almost identical. Switch building is about understanding that you're completing a sequence. The number of steps in that sequence, the number of times the child has to press the switch, actually doesn't mean very much at all. It's important that the child knows that they've seen something, and when they press the switch, something has changed, something has moved on. This models quite nicely how we use switches when we're step scanning. Unless the child understands and can identify pictures from parts of pictures, a far better way to teach this skill is to tell stories rather than build pictures. For example, take 5 photographs from a day in school. Perhaps it was a trip out on the bus. The first photograph, a picture of our class. The second photograph, a picture of us getting onto the school bus. The third photograph, our class at the garden centre. And with each switch press, the child can tell a story. Oh look, it's our class. I wonder where we're going. Oh, we're going on the bus. I wonder where the bus will take us. Oh, we're going to the garden centre. And so on. This is a much nicer, highly personalised and more effective way of teaching the skill of press it again. If you want to find out more about the problems with switch building, check out my other video, Switch Building 123 No, where I explore the problem in some depth and share some useful strategies for how to overcome that difficulty. On and off. This is another example of an activity where we've changed the rules for the student. On and off is usually called latching. That means pressing a switch to turn something on and then pressing it again to turn something off. The PowerLink toy control boxes all enable this method to be used with toys and main appliances. This is actually quite a difficult skill for a child to pick up, especially as up until now, under the old rules, as when their child pressed the switch, they get a reward. Now they press a switch and are given a reward, and they press it again and that reward is stopped. And that can bring in itself some challenges. I have fond memories of a classroom observation I once did with where the teacher set up a switch for a student to press with their head and set it to latch. When the child pressed the switch, it turned on her favourite piece of music, and when she pressed it again, it stopped. The teacher set the child working, the child pressed the switch, the music started, and the teacher moved on to the next student. By the time that the teacher got back round to that student again, probably 5 or 10 minutes later, the student was still listening to the music. What reason do you think the child would have to actually turn off something they enjoy? Well, none really, and that's exactly what would have happened. If the teacher hadn't intervened, the child would have turned the music on and sat and listened to it for the rest of the lesson. If we're going to be successful at teaching this particular skill, we have to come up with some meaningful ways that for the student to actually want to turn off the reward. Or perhaps turning it off is the reward itself. How about this? I used to provide the similar kind of activities to the teacher at the observation, a particular piece of music that the child enjoyed. The child would turn the switch and begin to listen to the music. And then I would become horrible teacher, and I'd go over and in my best Christopher Biggins voice I'd say, "Turn that off, it's absolutely terrible," and I would turn it off. And the child would press the switch to turn it back on again. And we were modelling this process of one press will turn it on, the second press will turn it off. And we'd continue like that for a little while. The child would begin to understand that the switch has two functions. It can either turn the activity on or turn the activity off. At which point I'd switch the tables around and I'd put a piece of music on that I know the child didn't particularly like. Something horrid, horrible loud rock music or opera music, whatever you think would work. And I would go along and start the music by pressing the switch. And I'd look at the child and say, "I like this music, it's lovely." And the child would usually turn it off. And I'd turn it on and the child would turn it off and we'd go through that process again. It sounds silly, but for the most part it works. And the child often really enjoys that interaction, that banter between you and them and the music. Here's some tips which you might find useful. I mentioned earlier about switch tapping. Some learners repeatedly bang or tap the switch, and there's often a number of reasons for this. The first is, actually, does the student understand what the switch is for? Is it just something that you've placed on their tray and they haven't made any kind of connection between this switch and the rewards that it generates? If that's the reason, or you suspect that's the reason, then I would highly recommend that you go back to the press and hold stage, where it's much easier for the child to understand that by putting their hand on the switch, they're making something happen. The second reason might be that the switch itself is too interesting. Is the student being stimulated by the tactile nature of the switch itself? That can be the feel of the switch or the noise that it makes when they press it. We've all heard children tap, 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 bang, bang, bang on the switch because it makes a loud noise, and it's quite an interesting tactile feel. It does get worse. Some switches, as you can see in the picture on the slide, have been made out of koosh balls or with particular tactile sensations in mind. These are always a problem. Switches like this can actually frustrate our assessment process. Imagine a child with very complex needs who's reaching out and touching a switch like that. What are they actually touching it for? Is it because when I press it, Bob the Builder sings a song and does a dance? Or is it because it feels nice and it's interesting tactile sensation? We don't need that level of complication. Keep it simple and don't use tactile switches at all. That last sentence has got me into a lot of trouble over the years, not least of which from some of the people more involved in sensory education who feel that activities need to have a sensory level. And I've heard them recommend covering switches with fur if a child is reluctant to touch a switch, or using jelly switches, and all manner of craziness. The last thing we need is there to be any ambiguity about why the child is pressing this switch, which is why I absolutely recommend that you don't use them. Perhaps with one exception, and the only exception that I've ever seen or been able to think about over the years, is if you're working with a child who has very low vision and needs to differentiate between the actions of two switches. One switch with one tactile sensation does this, the second switch with a different tactile sensation does that. And even then, it's a stretch, because many children can often find where those switches are and recognise the position that they're placed in without having to rely on some difference in tactile sensations to differentiate between them. Another reason why the child might be tapping or banging the switch is because the child actually enjoys your reaction to that. They bang, bang, bang on the switch and you come over and talk to them. Perhaps the oddest example I ever saw of this was a teacher who insisted on singing to their student whenever they needed talking to. So when the child bang, bang, banged on the switch, the teacher would go over and say, "Simon, Simon, don't bang the switch." And of course, I'm sat there observing this in classroom, thinking that I may have just climbed through the wardrobe and entered Narnia. What the teacher hadn't really understood is that the child was pressing this switch because she was singing to the child. In some ways, the child had developed an absolutely perfect understanding of cause and effect. If I bang this switch enough, you'll come over and sing me a song. If you suspect that this is the problem, you're going to have to work on the behavioural aspects of using switches. Believe me, changing the switch for something a little quieter isn't really going to solve the problem. I mentioned earlier about some of the difficulties that can come with inconsistent prompting. I don't want to spend too much time talking about a prompt hierarchy because it's very likely you already have your own in school. For those that are not aware of prompt hierarchies, I've put one on the slide to give you an idea of what that might look like. Perhaps the best bit of advice I can give you when working at this level is to remember to use switch caps. Switch caps are clear plastic caps which fit over the top of the switch and allow you to put a picture on top of the switch which can't be torn off or pulled off or in any way destroyed by the child that's using it. Having a picture on top of the switch helps the child make the connection between the switch and the reward that it generates. If the switch has a picture of a hippopotamus on it and you press that switch and a hippopotamus sings a song, that helps to make that connection. It's odd that switch caps are usually the first thing to be lost, but are actually probably one of the most useful things that you can use with your switches. So having worked with a student through all four of these different ways of accessing a switch, how do we know if we're being successful? Well, before we move a student on, we need to be absolutely sure that the child understands cause and effect in the context of switch use. And that means seeing them use a switch effectively across a range of different contexts, not just with the computer, not just with switch toys, but across a range of different contexts and a range of different times throughout the day too. So for example, using a switch with our morning greeting, using a switch as part of choosing a snack at break time, using a switch with some fun activities in golden time. That means looking for evidence that the child understands that the switch is generating the reward, and by pressing it they can choose to have the reward or not. If you're not really sure, ask somebody else to have a look, another colleague perhaps. It's really important that we're sure before we move our students on. For students working at this early cause and effect level, switches are an ideal way for them to interact with technology. We mentioned earlier using switches in a motivating way as part of things that happen every day in our classroom. And the more opportunities we can give children to use those switches, the better at it they'll become and the more likely they are to make more progress.